Hey, what's up guys? So we finally got a day of all draws, 4 draws today in the candidates. It seems like the players have kind of calmed down a bit. It was actually a pretty solid round, other than MVL, who missed a kind of forced tactical win against Grischuk. No one really had any huge advantages that they let slip. The games were pretty balanced, and looking at the games, I would say the level of defense was actually quite high. A lot of players had some small advantages, but really weren't able to put too much pressure or pose too many problems to their opponents. We had Fabiano Caruana drawing with white against Jan Nepomniachtchi. MVL drew with Grischuk. Wang Hao drew against Alexienko. And Liren made a draw with Anish Giri. So with 4 draws, that means the standings virtually haven't changed. We still have 3 players in the lead: MVL, Nepo, and Wang Hao. Caruana and Grischuk definitely within striking range at even score, and Liren, although he's still on -1, has clearly stabilized his play and is going to be a pretty dangerous opponent in the next several games. So going to the first game between Caruana and Jan Nepomniachtchi, we had a Grunfeld, which is pretty much Jan's main line and has been for the last several years. And Fabi chooses a pretty sharp and theoretical continuation with 7 bishop c4. This move used to be a lot more popular than it is now, but there's still tons and tons of theory in this line, hundreds, thousands of games. And going through the game here, Jan plays b6, one of the trendier options for black as of late, queen d2, bishop b7, and I believe the first novelty comes on move 16 here after some natural moves by both sides, where Fabi plays this very typical move h4 for these types of positions. Nowadays this move is highly thematic whenever the opponent has a fianchetto on the board, just to try to get the pawn to h5 and then eventually pushing the pawn to h6. We saw a few games by Alpha Zero where this pawn on h6 really made a strong impression. Carlsen also won a couple of games last year against the Grunfeld where he just drove this pawn to h6 and then used it to impose some positional pressure against the opponent. Although this move was a novelty based on the post-game press conference or the interview, it seems like Nepo was quite familiar with this move and definitely had some decent prep. That said, Fabi was able to get definitely some pressure in this game. It certainly wasn't clear that black was going to be able to hold this one. After d5, e6, knight c3, knight to c4 was played. Here Caruana decides to take on c4. I think Stockfish points out this move bishop f4 might have been a slightly better try for the advantage here. Now white would love to induce the move e5, as this would leave the d-pawn as a protected passer. Then after bishop g5, I think white would have a very serious positional advantage here, just tons and tons of space, and really the point of this h6 pawn is not so much to try and checkmate black on the g7 square, but rather leave black with these long-term back rank problems with queens on the board. Not to mention that in any endgame, the h7 pawn is going to be a pretty serious potential weakness. I think this might have been a slightly better chance in case of e takes d5, white would take with the knight, for example bishop d5, e d5, knight d6, queen c6, and this position seemed pretty unpleasant to defend for black with the 2 bishops against the bishop and knight. Not sure exactly how black would have reacted to this one, but in any case Fabi decided to take on c4 and play queen to d2, threatening to start just pushing the pawn to d6 if black is not careful. So Jan decides to take on d5, knight takes d5, knight f6 check is a potential threat, so bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and it seemed like white was definitely slightly better again with this pawn on d5 being a very strong potential passer. According to Fabi, what he kind of underestimated after a little bit of maneuvering g3 was this move king to f8, where black tries to sit with the king on e7, which is quite doable now that a lot of pieces have been exchanged, and white is ultimately not really able to create a whole lot of play here. The engine was pointing out queen to d4, king e7, and the problem for white is that he can't really come in with queen to g7 so easily, as black will have counterplay, for instance with queen e1 check, or even bishop takes g3 first and then queen to e1, with a lot of counterplay against white's king and with white's queen very far away on g7. I think the engine points out like queen h4 check, queen e4 check, and bishop d4. maybe white would have been able to pose a few more problems with this kind of setup, where black's king is still remaining pretty passive. Black has to find this move queen to b5 to cover the e8 square, and then maybe after something like king g2, white can certainly pose a few more problems here. The game continued with queen f3, and then after queen e1 check, king g2, f5. Black was able to kind of create enough space in the position that he was okay. FIDE continued to press, and I would say that just from a human point of view, this endgame that they got with the same color bishops, although the engine says black was holding and totally fine the whole time, I think this was not a particularly pleasant endgame to hold, but ultimately Nepo was able to do so, and the players eventually agreed to a draw. Moving on to the game between Liren and Anish Giri. This one started off with a Bogo Indian with bishop d2, a5. Then after bishop g2, Giri transposes back into the Catalan. With a pretty solid system for black, this move a5 I think is not the most popular line, but lately has been trending. White really doesn't want to take on b4s after a takes b4. Positionally, it's kind of advantageous for black to have opened up the a file, and this pawn on b4 restricts white's knight from being able to get out. So instead, Ding just develops normally, queen c2, c5, and yeah, this has been highly topical in the last several months. After cd5, black takes on d4, knight takes d4, queen to b6, e3, e takes d5, castles, and now knight to c6. And structurally, white is doing quite well against black's isolated pawn on d5, but black is ahead in development, and white doesn't have such a great way to keep his structural advantage. So he's forced to take on c6, b takes c6, rook to c1, and here comes Giri's novelty with the move rook to b8, not allowing white to take on c6 in view of black being able to take on d2 and eventually grabbing the b2 pawn. Now the engine points out that white could have a somewhat pleasant edge with knight c3 here. Not exactly sure what black had in mind. The idea with this move is to play knight to a4, eventually trade the bishops on b4, maybe establish this bishop on c3, but this knight in the long run is going to be trying to fight for the c5 square. To me, it looks like white would have some kind of pleasant edge here, but I'm sure Team Giri had this all worked out to a draw. In any case, Ding plays bishop takes b4, queen takes b4, b3, and now comes a really interesting move h5 from Giri, simply trying to again use the same idea that Fabi demonstrated against Nepo, run this h-pawn down the board, perhaps put it on h3 and create some long-term problems for white's king. I like how Ding reacted here. He plays knight c3, h4, and knight to e2, and I'm guessing this was not prepped by Giri here. I believe the engine was mainly suggesting the move knight to d2 as its top line, but knight c3 is quite logical, as now after knight e2, if black goes ahead and pushes with h3, this was kind of pointed out by Giri in the interview, and after bishop f1, the knight is coming to f4, and actually black will have a hard time holding on to this pawn. And the move g5 here would just be way too weakening in the long run, especially on the dark squares. So instead, black has to kind of slow down a bit. Bishop d7 was played, knight f4, h takes g3, h takes g3, and this advance on the h file has not really netted black a whole lot. I would say white is still slightly better here. Maybe this was the last chance when Ding could have fought for a little bit of an edge with this move knight to d3, with the idea of bringing the knight to c5. It still feels like a holdable position for black overall, but I would say white is the one that's playing for the two results here. Instead, we had bishop f3, and then after a4, b takes a4, and rook a8. Giri was actually able to hold this one pretty convincingly. Knight c5, rook a5, a4, rook a8, bishop d1, bishop e8, and now both sides start bringing in their kings. This move, knight e4, is not something I would recommend trying at home. It feels like it kind of weakens black structure, but actually Giri had everything under control. He first trades off white's active rook on b7, and then he's able to bring his king in, pushes c4. Again, kind of a somewhat counterintuitive move, as, okay, he wants to trade the c-pawn for the a-pawn, but after bishop c2, it seems like all of black's pawns are left on light squares, but black has enough activity with the king here to actually make sure that white isn't able to make any progress, and the players agree to a draw shortly after the time control and just a few more moves after this. Moving on to our next game between MVL and Grischuk. This game featured another Berlin endgame, and was quite similar to the game that Jan Nepomniachtchi played against Grischuk in round 2. I think this game made the most headlines of the day, not so much because of what happened over the board, but rather Grischuk's comment in the interview about spending over an hour on his 18th move after bishop b4 takes h4 g4 takes in this position. I guess people were already noticing during the game that he was spending so much time, again over an hour, on his next move. And as he explained in the post-game interview, while thinking about this move knight e7, he was 100% sure that MVL was going to play the move g4, and then he clarified, not 90% sure, 100% sure that MVL would play this move. But then MVL went ahead and played the move h4 here, which is a little bit less intuitive, but okay, comes with its own benefits of, let's say, securing the knight on g5. And all of a sudden it was, you know, an hour of the clock down the drain for Grischuk. I mean, he was able to eventually hold the game, but he did have to suffer a scare later on. One thing that was curious is that MVL actually had this position in the base and the database previously. He had this against Nakamura in an online speed chess game where he did play the move g4. So I'm not sure if this was part of Grischuk's preparation or if he just couldn't remember exactly what he looked at here. But yeah, spending an hour just to be surprised by your opponent's response is clearly not good time management. And well, this is nothing new for Grischuk. His time pressure has literally become a meme at this point. And well, going on to what happens, he ends up grabbing this pawn on c3. MVL actually plays this position in a really sharp style. I mean, he just sacrifices one of his c-pawns. The knight on a4 is now misplaced, and he's basically playing against Black's king in the center here, looking for ideas like knight takes f7 tactics, knight takes c6 possibly. Here Black plays bishop d5, rook f4, knight b6, and as many people have already pointed out, MVL missed to win on move 30. As he starts pushing and advancing on the king side, Black's position really comes under a lot of pressure here. And now he plays a very strong move a4, trying to continue to dislodge Black's pieces with a5 and setting up bishop a3 check. Grischuk grabs the pawn on a4, and here MVL ends up playing bishop a3, which just gets blocked with c5 and ends up missing his opportunity, and the game was later drawn. As engines were kind of pointing out immediately, and I believe Wesley So in the chess.com commentary was pointing out, this move rook e4 was actually winning by force for white. The main point is that in case of bishop e6, we have knight takes e6, fe, bishop g5 check, king e8, rook f3. The knight on a4 is still hanging. Black has to defend it with either b5 or save it with knight c5. Then after the move rook e f4, Black basically has no defense to the rook coming to the 7th rank. Keep in mind the king is already moved, so Black is not able to castle here. And once this rook gets to the 7th rank and gets to e7 or takes this g7 pawn, White is basically just going to win the game with the two connected passers on g4, h5. In the interview, MVL actually admitted to forgetting that after b5, rook takes c4 is actually a winning combination for White. bc4, the point is rook takes f7 check. The king has to go either to e8 or to d8, which would run into knight e6 check. Let's say king e8, rook takes c7. Even though White is down in exchange, he's totally dominating the position. The knight is coming to e6, the bishop is coming to g5. There's going to be mating ideas with rook e7. Of course, this g7 pawn is hanging, and in the meantime, Black has no development, no counterplay whatsoever with his two rooks on the back rank. Again, no opportunity to castle here, and White's pieces are just going to be completely dominating here. So yeah, I mean, it seems like MVL kind of missed a trick that I think for him should be almost instant, but well, sometimes this happens when you're playing against your opponent who's in severe time pressure. You get this feeling like you kind of have to play a little bit quicker to put some pressure on them, and as a result this causes a lot of players to miss opportunities. So I would say this was kind of the biggest miss of the day. Later on, MVL might have had some small chances in the resulting rook endgame. For the full analysis of this game and for kind of a deeper psychological picture of Grischuk's incessant time trouble, I'd encourage you guys to watch Jesse's Move of the Day video for round 4. It was a really interesting analysis of why players get into time trouble and how that situation can often play out. So definitely make sure to check that out. We'll be linking to it in the description below. And in the final game of the day between Wang Hao and Alexienko, we had a pretty interesting symmetrical Grunfeld here. I believe this is a part of both players' repertoire. And Wang Hao chose a pretty solid system here with knight d2 and b3. The players followed some theory, a4, b takes a4, queen a5, where black is going to be winning back this a4 pawn. And going to the position after move 13, rook fc1, Alexienko criticized his move rook a6 after the game. He said it was a very dumb move. Previously, I believe queen takes a4 was played, perhaps in correspondence chess, where it seems like black has a pretty solid position. The b7 pawn is not really hanging in view of rook b8 and the bishop on b2 hanging, and objectively things stand very close to equal. In general, this is a very solid line. Rook a6 seems like it was kind of a slow move. After e3, white is simply going to be playing bishop f1 soon, and black really cannot allow the bishop to come to b5, so black kind of has to grab this pawn on a4 anyway, and has kind of lost a tempo here. Although I would say that Alexienko really showed some very good defense in this game. Even though white was slightly better for most of this endgame, he never had any actual real chances, and black found a lot of nice moves to survive. That said, as Alexienko explained, it was still kind of a mistake to fall into this position where instead of having this solid game, black now has to find a lot of only moves just to hold the position. But he definitely was up to the task. I think Wang Hao had some small opportunities to maybe fight for a slightly bigger advantage. I would say the critical moment took place at this point when black went knight takes c5, d takes c5, e5, and white pushed b4. And the situation has definitely sharpened up a little bit. I mean, black now has the two bishops, but it's clearly white who's better with this potential outside pass pawn with b4 and c5. Black's pawn on b7 being, of course, a very critical weakness. If black loses this one, then the game would basically be over. So for instance, there would be a lot of ways to blunder in this position. If king f7, bishop c6, and white is just going to be winning a pawn on the spot. And after a move like bishop e6, for example, white has this idea to play e4, where the point is that if black pushes d4 or plays d takes e4, white is going to be trading the light squared bishops with bishop c4, and then after takes, knight takes c4, white's king is going to be able to cover black's d pawn quite easily, whereas the knight and rook are just going to win the pawn on b7, and then white will have these two connected pass pawns that will just decide the game. So Alexienko finds the only move to make a convincing draw here, and that is this move b6, where he gives white a very strong pass pawn on c6, grabs the pawn on b4. Wang Hao plays a critical move here with e4. Black takes with the pawn. I think this was also correct, as after bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, d takes e4, white can throw in bishop c4 check, and when the king moves, white will have c7 followed by bishop e6 and winning a full rook. So instead, Alexienko finds d takes e4, which is much more accurate. Now Wang Hao played knight takes e4. Kind of a simple combination where he temporarily gives up a piece, but banks on the fact that his c-pawn will eventually cost black a full rook. Unfortunately for white, he's not really left with enough pawns on the board after that to win the game. So bishop c4 was the continuation, bishop e6. Now black had a couple of ways to make a draw here. I think black's choice, bishop f5, was certainly good enough. The engine suggests moves like bishop c5, simply letting white promote immediately, and ending in this endgame with rook and bishop versus two bishops, where black also has two pawns for the exchange. This one is probably drawish, but I would say with the side that has the rook, the extra exchange having an extra minor piece, a lot of times this gives a few more winning chances as the rook has some help. So I feel like black's decision to play bishop f5 here is actually pretty technical and pretty interesting, as the engine doesn't like it, but once white promotes here, black takes this one, bishop takes c8, white wins the bishop back immediately with rook a8, and it's as if we just traded off those pair of minor pieces. Now we just have a pure endgame rook versus bishop, but white is just not able to really pose any problems here. Rook c7 check was played, the king goes to h6, not to the back rank, and after h4, f5, king g2, e4, Wang Hao just offered a draw with king f1 here, recognizing that he doesn't have any kind of plan to improve his position. The bishop on c5 is defending black's weakness on b6 and is rock solid. It's also hitting white's main weakness, the pawn on f2, which means that white's king cannot just start traveling up the board and trying to create play. And with just one rook on the 7th rank, white isn't really able to create any kind of real counterplay here, and the players agreed to a draw. So overall, a very solid round. There was definitely one big opportunity there for MVL, who had a potentially winning position and huge advantage on the clock against Grischuk. He missed that one, but that means that going into round 5, we're basically in the same situation as we were before the round. Now there doesn't appear to be as many decisive games as there were in the first few rounds, but I feel like with the pressure and stress of the tournament just kind of building up round by round, of course we're going to see tons of action in the future rounds to come. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, please do leave a like or a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow, and we'll be seeing you guys in future rounds. We'll be covering every single round of this tournament with the daily recaps and Jesse's Move of the Day series. Hope you have a good one, stay healthy, and see you next time. Take care.